Welcome, everyone, to the April 22nd, 2024 edition of the Midwest Big Data Innovation Hub's Data Science Student Group webinar series. I'm JD Graham, the Outreach and Engagement Specialist, and I'm joined with my colleague, John McMullen, the Executive Director of the Hub. And I'm excited to have a group of 5 data visualization experts to talk about how to use data to tell compelling stories. But before we begin, I'd like to begin with an overview of the Hub. We are a regional organization funded by the National Science Foundation, working within a 12-state area of the Midwest of the U.S. But we're also part of a national network of 4 hubs founded in 2015 to be a catalyst for connecting diverse groups across the country. We're focused on data science and data-related activities in academia, industry, government, and nonprofits. Building collaborations and partnerships between sectors is what we do. So as a part of this webinar series, we bring together university science students, leaders from official RSAs, as well as informal organizations to share best practices, their experiences in developing programmatic activities and different ways of building local communities. Additionally, we have recruit speakers to talk on a variety of subjects graduate and undergraduate science students care about. Our goal is to learn from each other and to help build a network of student leaders across our region. The Hub has this webinar series, a Slack community, and profiles of student groups on our website. We encourage you to join our future webinars. Reach out to us if you'd like to participate, and if your group would like to be in a webinar or profile series. Also know that you can rewatch this at any time. The recording will be on YouTube and available on our site. But now I'd like to introduce today's guests. We have 5 amazing guests. I am so lucky to be with these people. The list of your accomplishments is so long. I don't want to take too much time for that, but it can't be discounted exactly who we have and the awesome lineup of people we get to talk to, or I get to talk to today. We'll start with John Nerge, GIS and data analyst coordinator for the Brooklyn Park. He's also a geo mentor. We have Dr. Molly Hirst, data curator at Dryad, data expert with Curator, and data scientist with Upwork. Dr. Yitong, research associate and instructor at the University of Toledo, also with Midstory, which is a multimedia storytelling educational organization that the Hub is associated with. So let everyone know we do have an association there. Along with Dr. Kevin Czajkowski, distinguished professor at the University of Toledo, director, SISS, director of the GIS certificate program, director of satellites program, and also part of Midstory. And also Dr. John Schwabish, founder of PolicyViz, senior fellow at the Urban Institute, and author of Better Data Visualizations, a guide for scholars, research, and walks. Wow. It is great to have you all here. Again, I'm lucky to have such really interesting panel of people to talk to today. But I kind of want to open it up just to get things started, just that very baby step, an introduction into data storytelling. Maybe you could start us off, John. Well, let's go, John S. What exactly is data storytelling? Why is it so important? What is this power we have to tell stories with data?
Yeah, so I think a part of this maybe some of my fellow panelists will disagree with me, which would be great to get us started off in a spicy way. I mean, I think the phrase data storytelling or storytelling with or around data is an overused phrase. I think oftentimes we're actually not telling stories. I think most of the time we're in fact making a point or making an argument or we're facilitating exploration. I think stories have their own specific structures and specific meaning. And my perspective on telling stories with data is that if we were more careful about the use of the word stories, we would actually think more carefully about what we are actually doing with our data and what it means to tell a story, what a tension is, what a resolution of that tension means. But I think that may just be a nuanced take that is unnecessary. I think in general, when people say telling stories, they mean here's some data, here's some trend or some pattern or some distribution. But I think oftentimes we are kind of throwing that word around story so that it sounds a little, maybe a little cuter, a little sexier, a little something that people can connect with. But I think that's underlying a lot of what we're trying to do is trying to get people to connect with data, and stories are a great way to do that because we all understand what stories are and what they mean to us.
What about the idea? I mean, telling stories in it, obviously doing it with data and telling it visually that way. What are some of the challenges of connecting that idea of why it's important, and what challenges are then do we have to overcome because it's such a visual medium, and it doesn't always have a story that we get to read along with it.
Well, I think first off, we human beings, we are visual creatures, and we are just more likely to recognize and remember information when we see it presented visually rather than a long bit of text or a set of bullet points. When we use graphs and charts and illustrations, we're just more likely as human beings to recognize and remember that information. And I think as our communication platforms have changed, in particular, I would say since 2007, when the iPhone was introduced, the way that we consume information has changed so dramatically, and the amount of content that is available to us has changed so dramatically that in turn has changed the way that we interact with, I'll say news, but use that as kind of a general term to include not just news from your traditional news organizations, but also social media, but also research and analysis. And the way that that information makes its way to us has completely changed. And so to be able to try to cut through that fire hose of content, that fire hose of information, we need to get and grab people's information. And so I think while many of us are familiar with and accustomed to using standard graph types like bar charts and line charts, area charts, pie charts, I think what we've seen over the last 10, 20, 25 years is an expansion of the types of visual ways that people present their information. And part of that has been driven by the tools that we have, and in some ways, sort of the opposite. The tools have driven our ability to communicate data. I think that is driven this ability for us to engage people in very different ways through our data and through our visualizations.
Kevin, I know you've done a lot of work with telling stories through data, using data in an environmental type directions. What are some of the reasons that it's so important to be able to tell those stories, especially about the environment? What makes it a unique world, and how does this data visualization kind of dovetail into that?
I think you said Kevin, is that right, JD?
Yes, Kevin. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, I don't know, John blew up the story already, saying that it's overused. Uh, I think and I'm not a great storyteller, so that's one of the challenges also, to have like a cliffhanger or any, elements of a story. So I think of us using data to tell stories. Basically, we're trying to make a point, and that's what John brought up is, and I kind of look at it when you're making a graph or a map, you want to have, I call it the money shot. This is the key that maybe engages people or really grabs attention. So I guess that's my insight into this.
And how about you, John Nerge? What are you thinking? How can you add to this in your role, and what do you think data storytelling really is and why it's important?
Yeah, and I have to apologize. My internet blipped there for just a second. So I want to apologize if I'm covering the same thing somebody else talks. I'm not trying to steal from you. I literally just didn't hear you. I think thinking about storytelling in the larger like data literacy model, it's kind of the last step, which is you can read data, you can work with it, you can analyze it, but ultimately you need to be able to communicate it. And I would say that is where the story comes in. a good quote, which I can't remember, unfortunately, who said it, but was that we hear statistics, but we feel stories. So I think in my role, particularly in local government, um, where stories matter as far as policy or helping people understand how a government functions, is avoiding the curse of knowledge. And that's something I think that for data experts, that's basically saying, like, once you become an expert in something, you lose the ability to um, sympathize with people who don't have that. You just assume that's common sense. So there's a lot of work to make sure, like if I'm working with demographic data or things like that, I make sure to not assume it's compelling on its own. I think that's why the story matters, is you can present facts, but facts won't beat stories. You can only beat the story in somebody's head. Like if you're talking with senior leaders or things like that who already have an idea of what they want to do, you're not going to change their minds with facts. You're only going to change their mind with a better story.
John, I think you brought up a really awesome point, though, about learning in general. Uh, you can maybe remember learning something, and then you can kind of maybe piggyback that on to try to explain the data. But there's a point in your career, and especially when you become an expert and have immersed yourself in it, where you don't remember when you learned that. It just almost becomes a way of life. Why is it so hard to teach someone to ride a bike? You don't remember exactly how you did it. You just know how to do it. But that really is our purpose here, right? Is to learn the reasons why and how to teach somebody to ride that bike. This time it's through data visualization. Molly, I mean, how do you teach somebody to ride that bike when when you already know it so well? How does that make it difficult to tell that data visualization story? Or is there a unique opportunity there of why we tell stories doing this?
I really think simplification is the key here. So I will respectfully disagree with John S. I think that it's, wonderful that we're calling it data storytelling. I think it makes data sound a lot less scary. And I think that we can really tell a story with data where we have a problem. Let's say we have a company that has a problem, and we have all this data. We need to find out who the villain is. Maybe the company's losing money and we don't know why. So, you use that data to find out who the villain is. Okay, the villain is that these bots are coming in and like downloading all this data from our website, and that's become a huge money suck for our company. So we've identified the data, we've overcome that hurdle, and then you move on to the next step in the story. Maybe there's a sequel. And I think that is kind of where the term data storytelling kind of comes from, is that, depending on the data type and everything, you can always try to make a story out of it. As for your follow-up question, JD, about visualizations and how to really teach someone how to do it, again, I think simplicity is key, and also teaching them the very basics, just to start with. I think that is a good place to always start. I think it's kind of difficult and really depends on the type of data that you're working with. Like, are you visualizing data for a company? Are you visualizing genomic data? Like, what are you trying to actually see? So I think the first thing that you really need to do is to make sure that you understand what you're trying to teach this person, what their background kind of is, and then you can kind of make the steps to figure out the best way to move forward with that.
Molly, it definitely sounds like, we're saying, what you have to present, but I can also hear the subtext, and also with all the different experts we have in all your different fields, I think it's also the who you're presenting it to. Yitong, what has your experience been about the different types of people you're presenting to, the different types of audiences you have? whether they're other experts, whether it's financial, whether it's local governments or larger than local governments, or the populace in general. What does that look like, and how do you, mold the data to a visualization story for each of those audiences? Or am I wrong? If you do it well, it will work for all audiences nearly equally.
Yeah, I think you bring up a very important point is the audience. I think each audience have a different perspective. I think all researchers can agree that when we are doing research, when it's going deeper, it's going very narrow in our own field. And only maybe in the world, a few people knows exactly what we're doing. We're using our own language, and we're using those terminologies, and we're using the own way to communicate. But if without translating or without a way to communicate, nobody in the general public knows what we're doing. So I think that's for me, that's very important for the data storytelling, because it could be very simple to translate something complicated to very simple for general public to understand. And I think for government, different department, they sometimes I feel also treat them like a general public, but in different perspective. They probably need to know a certain perspective more than other perspective, depending on which department they're in. And for general public, just needs more guidance, step by step, asking simple questions, maybe not too quick to have a conclusion. It's just different ways facing different people.
Yeah. John S., I know you have presented to, I think, a very wide audience. I mean, first of all, being an author and talking about data science, a visual medium, and, you don't have the benefit of being able to have your own voice there. But then at other times, you're presenting lectures or giving a talk, and you can supplement that with your own personality. What kind of changes do you make for different types of audiences?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think Yitong nailed it on the head, right? Like every audience is very different. So when it comes to presenting to an audience, I think the first thing that's pretty obvious, I think it's obvious in this conversation. It's not obvious to many presenters because they clearly don't do it. But like academic presenters, faculty members use jargon all the time, no matter who they're speaking to, right? But like when they're speaking to their colleagues in the department, that's fine because they all know the jargon, they all share that language. But when you're talking to a policymaker or a funder or another stakeholder or kids, right? Like the jargon just changes. I mean, prior to the pandemic, when my kids were in elementary school, like I would teach data visualization to the 4th and 5th graders, and the words that you use, the way you describe things, the assumed knowledge, right? You can't just assume that 4th graders know what a map of the United States looks like. Like you need to think about who these different audiences are and what their level of expertise and also their level of interest that they bring to it. And it extends to the data visualizations that we put in our written work. I mean, one example that I love to show in my workshops and classes is this, and it's in one of my books, is this bubble chart from the LA Times. It's this great bubble chart. And it's only got like 20, 25 cities in California. And the horizontal axis is like something like the violent crime rate in these cities. And the horizontal or the vertical axis is the property crime rate. And so you've got these bubbles across these different cities in California. But they add all this annotation to the graphic. So they shade each of these 4 quadrants to help you navigate like what each quadrant means for each of these different relationships. And then they, in the text, in the quadrants, it's this little bold-faced text. They tell you, okay, in this quadrant, this variable is going up and this one's going down. And, I love that as an example because I think about the average LA Times reader who might not know how to read a bubble chart. I mean, everybody on this call knows how to read. I mean, we just assume that everybody on this call knows how to read a bubble chart because it's a data hub, right? So you sort of assume people coming to a data hub webinar on a Monday afternoon know how to read a bubble chart. But that's not true for everybody. But it's also true that if I were to publish that same graph in an academic journal, right, in a data science or an economics journal, I wouldn't include all that annotation and labels, because I could assume that everybody knows how to read that graph. They understand it. And so it is true no matter, I mean, just kind of reinforcing Yitong's point, like no matter if you're presenting or you're writing something down, I think language is the first place that I think about. But then it sort of extends to how do we incorporate language onto the visualization? What are the visualization types we use, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Does anybody want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Yeah, I was thinking of two things. One is I was thinking simplification is something I wanted to bring up today too. So everybody's bringing it up. I suspect that I try to simplify even at all levels, even for a publication. And a publication is a story. So in a way, you're telling a story through your the introduction, the methodology, the data that you're presenting, the graphs and all, and then the conclusions you're drawing from it. So if you can tell a compelling story, that's a good, in your publications. Another thing I think I do pretty well is for getting external funding, you have to tell a good story in your proposals. Why should they fund you? And I think some of the people in this audience might be trying to get proposals funded someday. So simplification, I think, is a real key to all this. And many times my students will make some wildly complex graph. Always like, please simplify this.
Right.
What's the message that you want coming from this graphic?
I know it's kind of a silly example, but one of the best data simplifiers I've ever found was the writer Randall Munroe from the webcomic series XKCD. He could just take these poignant little moments and put them into a data visualization that's obviously funny, but I've learned things from that just as much. And he uses, if you're not familiar with him, he uses only line drawings and stick figures to tell the story, and it's kind of a funny way to do it. But it also, to tell such a story so simplistically, takes actually an incredibly high level of knowledge and understanding of the material and your audience to be able to do that. I don't know, have you come along with that before as well, Molly? Like when you have these different, again, you've been lots of different places doing lots of different audience members for data visualization. Is there different ways you change it up that we haven't discussed yet?
You know what? To go off of the simplification model, I really think that, that is the key here. So I remember, I don't like to think about it, but I remember some of my first presentations when I was a PhD student. And, there were, depending on like whether it was a talk or a poster, there was a lot of text. There was a lot of text. I was talking a lot about a lot of different things. And it wasn't until like my fourth year, I took a science communication course, and shout out to George Kling here at Michigan. One of the things that I took away from that course was, no matter what you're presenting, be it a visualization, an idea in a poster or a presentation, keep your sentences crayon simple. So I've carried that with me the entire, years since I've been out of grad school. But going back to what Kevin was talking about, even making your sentences in your manuscripts and in your grant proposals crayon simple, so that no matter who your audience is, they can follow along with it. Oftentimes when we read academic papers, there are a lot of run-on sentences, a lot of ideas in one section, but to really hold an audience, to really hold their attention, and to really get them to get the takeaway message, you want to be as simple as possible. and focus on 1 to maybe 3 takeaway messages for the whole thing, for the whole presentation. For visualizations, I think it should be even smaller, like 1 takeaway, maybe even half of a takeaway, if that. But yeah, I think that really carries a lot of weight in all of data visualization.
Once we get this simplified, beautiful looking piece of data, and you start to tell that story. And again, I've kind of brought this up. Sometimes you get to tell that story, and you throw that football out there and you hope somebody catches it. And after they do, it's done. It's not yours anymore. And other times you get to be right there with it, telling that story, and interacting with your audience. How do we avoid just stating what's there? Like, how do you prepare for that story if you're going to be involved as well, and not just reading the cliff notes and not just describing what they're seeing? What do you think that looks like, John Nerge? Like, you especially have a very diverse audience of people who could be highly educated or could be an elected official that comes in because they're just well liked and maybe has no understanding of the data or maybe the complexities that you're trying to present.
I think in that point, we're moving from simplification to personalization. So to use your analogy of throwing stuff out there, that would be like I'm throwing a ball out to this panel versus if I say, JD, catch, that's personalized, right? That's identifying who that person is. When in my work with GIS, I make a lot of interactive maps, and it doesn't matter what the topic is. I can tell you the first thing people will do, regardless of what the map is they want to zoom to their house. That's how we ground. That's how we ground it. So understanding what is that personalization piece for people, instead of just being like, here's the data, it's compelling, it says we should do this, is what are those person's preconceived notions? What's the aha moment specific to that target audience? Which means sometimes, depending on the story you're telling, you have to modify the story for different people that it's being presented to. Depending on what you're doing, sometimes that can involve, if you can pre-board key decision makers, if you can get to people ahead of time and kind of prepare them for the story. Of course, that's not always possible. But yeah, it's just thinking about what's in it for the person, and not just assuming that data is compelling enough on its own objectively. You have to make that connection to that person's goals, that person's interests. And I also think something that we fail to do too often is, particularly if we're challenging a preconceived notion. And there have been studies on this about, and this is true of politics, and this is true of everything, which is that you can't change somebody's mind by proving they're wrong. You can only change somebody's mind by giving them something else. So if people would prefer wrong information than a lack of information. So it's also making sure that if you're changing the narrative for them, you're putting something in place of what you're changing.
Right. Yeah. First rule of public speaking, I suppose, or teaching, is know thy audience, right? That's really important. And does anybody else want to add into there? Again, that component of when you're there presenting, and not just restating what's being shown, or maybe even just those captions and words, adding on to the idea again, yes, knowing your audience and knowing what they need to hear, super important. But I was just looking for anybody else's techniques of how they do that.
Well, yeah, I think Yitong and I could bring up our urban heat out and story map for Toledo. So, and I think John's mentioned about using GIS to make a map and then making a story map out of it, and that's one of the ArcGIS applications. But Yitong, do you want to talk about your Midstory story map?
Sure. So in addition to work with Dr. C on the educational engagement project, I also volunteer at Midstory. So very briefly about Midstory is this JD already introduced. So Midstory is trying to voice out for the Midwest region because the major media are all on the coasts, and we are trying to do the research project and also the high school college programs and the multimedia storytelling. So what I want to show is an example of the story that we created with the Inter here. So JD, can you enable me to share screen?
You should be able to. I have made you a co-host. I can click that again just to make sure. Here we go. How about now?
Okay. Are you able to see?
Yes, good. Yeah.
So this is a story map of exploring urban heat island in Toledo, Ohio. So first, there's some simple introduction of what is urban heat island effect. And this is a surface temperature map of a Toledo area. And going down, here is you can move back and forth to see which area is hotter and which area is cooler. So like this river is cooler, and this downtown area is hotter. And if you go in here, the airport has a relatively high temperature than the surrounding agriculture fields. And we identified 10 hottest areas in Lucas County. And you click on that, it has some interactive functions, like the average temperature in this census tract. And then we showed exactly where those 10 locations located and how they look like. So surprisingly, the hottest temperature on that day is the Amazon warehouse, which is not in the downtown area. It's further away, but I think because of the transportation and because of the building materials, so this place was the hottest area that day. And other places are some in downtown area, and the fourth one is our school, University of Toledo, and because of lots of parking lot, darker area, so it absorbs more heat. And this field is the artificial turf field, so it attracts more heat too. And the major transportation intersection also is have a higher temperature. And so those are the top 10 hottest areas. And there are some simple analysis and lead people to the people of color and the median household income. And then there's a simple comparison of how the heat related to people of color and how the heat compare with the distribution of median household income. So it is a very simple story, but also I want to continue the conversation before. So how to work with the audience. And I think to me, the audience is also part of the storytelling, because I like your analogy that we are throwing out a ball and see who can catch it. And sometimes we need to lead them to catch it. And the audience, if they are exploring this story and they understand it, then I think they're part of the story and they make the story complete. So some audience catch the ball. And this is what we're trying to do is we want to make the story more accessible, removing the barriers between academia and the general public. And we also want to make the story more understandable to a wider population. In addition to that, we also want to make it more engaging, it's make people want to look at the story and make it interactive and even inspiring to make people like want to do something about it. So Dr. C, you want to continue?
Sure. Yeah. So I just want to follow up on how, Yitong's story map led to the city of Toledo being engaged in looking at the urban heat island effect. And then they started looking at trees, and we helped them map the trees in the city, realizing that the city, after the emerald ash borer killed the ash trees, had very few trees or, lower tree coverage than many cities. That led to action. They got a grant from NOAA to study urban heat island further. And then now I've gotten a large grant for planting trees. So I think it's $6 million for planting trees. And they're looking at which neighborhoods should the trees be planted in to mitigate urban heat island. So it's an example of, Midstory is a nonprofit that Yitong works with, made a story map that presented the material in a simple manner that everybody could understand, but then now has led to action.
And I think you guys have really clicked into what John Nerge was saying too. When John said, hey, people want to do first, they want to zoom into their house. And what I think you're trying to say, John, is people want to interact with the data. And of course, they want to personalize it to themselves. I know that Midstory, of course, that's not where I live, but I know I would want to maybe try to find myself there. But even if I couldn't, I would be able to interact with that data and play with it. I mean, fundamentally, humans love to tell stories and we love to play. And I think being able to play with it interactively, even though you're not there to tell that story any longer, helps the story tell itself at maybe the pace of the person who wants to interact with it. I don't know, does anyone else have any kind of experience in data that can be manipulated by the audience as well? And what are some of the challenges you have to overcome, doing that besides maybe the technical of whatever computer system or ways they're viewing it?
So JD, before we go on to that, can I I'm gonna poke everybody again. I know Molly's like,
I'm giving you a stick, John. Go for
Molly's
it.
like ready to. So I think Yitong's example is a perfect example of why I'm not a big fan of this whole conversation about simplifying. So we've all said, everybody said, oh, let's make everything simple. Let's simplify everything. Well, I think if you look through that piece, there is a ton of data going on in there. There is a ton of analysis going on in there. That is not simple. Well, I think the word that we should be using is to clarify rather than simplify, because what we're doing here is what Yitong and your team has done is taking a very complex, a large amount of data, a very complex, and I'll use the word story here, even though I think I don't love it, but a complex story, and distilled it down and made it clear for people so they can understand how this, in this particular case, how these heat gradients impact their lives. So I know lots of people use that word simplify, and I get the intuition behind it, but I think a lot of times what we're not simplifying, because simplifying to me sort of implies that we're narrowing down or we're stripping out a bunch of data to get to this one line or this one bar to see this one thing. But I think a lot of visualizations actually don't do that. They show us a lot of data, but it's easy to see that, oh, across all 50 states, we see all these states in this trend are going, they're not moving, but look at this one state, and this big bold red line has been climbing up over this same period. That's not simplified, that's just clarified. So I know it's a sort of nuanced difference, but since Molly didn't like my nuanced take on stories, I thought I would just kind of keep poking at everybody.
Oh, John, I think that's what we mean too, and that's a great point, and especially since we are talking to a lot of data science students who are maybe at the beginning of their career. They could easily hear that simplified idea and think everything needs to be made into that one data point.
Right.
But the beauty is really in the clarification, whether we're talking any art form, really, right?
Yeah.
You are clarifying and distilling down, as you even said. And I'm sure you have other things you'd want to add to the idea of the interactive data as well, but I think it makes perfect sense. And I doubt anybody here would disagree with you.
I'm looking at Molly to see, but she's nodding. So I think we're back to being friends.
Yeah, I definitely, I'm on board with the clarification idea. I hadn't thought about that before, but it makes a lot of sense, especially, as data scientists, what we're doing is we're taking a big jumble of data and we're trying to make sense of it, right? Essentially like clarifying a puzzle. Like, what is the puzzle going to be? You have all these pieces piled up. What's the puzzle going to be when you put it together? So,
I love the crayon idea. Write as a crayon, but I also think that's clarifying. I think, JD, to your point of like, especially for people who are just getting started, because I think if you said here's a data set of, I don't know, I'm a big hockey fan, right? So here's a big data set of the Washington Capitals, or every hockey team's number of wins over the last 50 years, right? And you say to people who are just starting out, simplify this. Well, okay, so simplify and say, all right, let's pick out the Caps over time, and here's that line, and you're done. But clarify really would help you see, okay, the Caps were good at this period relative to another team that you wouldn't get. So, yeah. So I'll stop
really,
there. I do have thoughts on the interactive piece, but I want others who have interactive piece something different.
For me to clarify, it really sounds like we're saying good data visualization doesn't lose information. It just elucidates that information. It makes it understandable and graspable, but not actually less information if it's not warranted. Of course, sometimes you can trim the fat, but I just want to make sure we're clarifying. I think that's what you're all saying, really. But I'll give you a chance also to talk about the interactive portion of whenever you present data, because that seems to be a whole different animal. And we haven't even really brought up yet either the idea of accessibility and who can access this. And first of all, that's just people are going to have certain limitations of maybe eyesight or the or ways to interact with the data, but it could be also just their platforms they can see data on. Who are we making this for, and how can they access it?
Yes, I really liked in Yitong's little presentation there how big the map was. So thinking about visualizations, making it big and making it simple. So you could tell what it was, you could interact with it, which makes it more exciting for people to use. And also I thought the color scheme was really nice because she was showing a gradient. So people who might be a certain type of colorblind could still be able to use that. I know working in R a lot, there are a lot of different color schemes that are colorblind friendly. And so a lot of people tend to stick with those color schemes just to be more accessible. I think I have a lot of like personal arguments for different types of accessibility in terms of who has access to data and stuff like that, because I work at an open access data repository, and like how they get it, etc. But I feel like that would be a much longer conversation, so I'll kind of pass it to somebody else now.
John Nerge, we haven't heard much from you on this one, or Kevin, please speak up as
I
well.
just-
It's a conversation. It's fine.
Going back on what John Schwabish said, that yes, maybe sometimes when people simplify data, the science becomes wrong, right? And I have a problem with that. And sometimes I have this argument with people where they say, well, does it really matter? And climate change is one of the topics where this happens a lot. People simplify the data to change people's minds, but it sometimes is scientifically inaccurate. And I think it's important to retain that scientific accuracy and integrity.
Yeah,
think
I
it's the
think
same-
that you're right.
Oh, go ahead.
That, you know, if you can feel like you have maybe a moral point to make, you might be you might not always stick exactly to the science. I'm sorry, Molly. Continue.
Yeah, I think we're all on the same page with clarification now instead of simplification. So thanks for that, John S. But the reason being, like, yes, you can undersimplify your data, and that will lead to false results. But you can also like, you can have too many variables, and that can also bring in a lot of noise and give you, bad results that lead to something that you don't want. So I think your point, Kevin, was clarification, regardless of, how actually simple the data might be.
I think he's proving the point well enough that he couldn't change anyone's mind by just refuting. He had to replace, and he has done it. He has replaced that idea. Perfect. But I did want to go to John Nerge and ask about, again, especially working with governments, how important is it to try to make this data? We have a very, again, wide audience, and different ways maybe they can even access this information, let alone the ability to make it interactive.
Yeah, so I'm going to go to, and I don't have this memorized. I wrote it down on my notes here specific for this, just to make sure I'm not quite that much of a geek. But Herbert Simon, who is a famous social scientist, had the quote, "A wealth of information creates a poverty of attention." I think that's we're kind of all talking about that. But again, going back to governments, one of, just to use a concrete example, one of the things we're often tasked with is sharing out information, of course. And one of those topics a lot of times is crime statistics, because that's just a hot topic. Everybody wants to know that kind of stuff. I personally think you'll be hard pressed to find a city that's doing a crime statistics dashboard well. And that's because they take that approach of, well, let's just put everything out there and let's let everybody drill down to every single thing. And I think the intent there is good, is like, wow, there's all these like amazing ways you can cut the data up with this dashboard. But what gets lost on the data scientist is, but the people who are going to use this application are not also data scientists. So I think I'm going to dangerously weigh into the simplification versus clarification conversation. But I also want to say, I think this is we're getting into a semantics conversation here, because I think we all agree. The data scientist's role is to simplify the data in order to create clarity, in order to avoid overcomplicating the data and creating confusion, right? So it's a both and, I think. But it's knowing the right model. A common one in communications areas, which is the area that I work in, is talking about a bite snack meal model. And you see this a lot. Like the classic example is like a news headline, right? The news headline is the bite. It tells you what the story is. Like, you don't have to, you've had plenty of times where you're talking to your friends and you're like, oh, did you hear about it? Well, I didn't actually read the article, but I saw the headline. That's your bite. The snack is the little blurb up ahead of the bullet points, then the meal. So trying to do that with data storytelling is also making sure that, okay, if we want as many people as possible to read this, we need a bite version. For the people who are a little more curious, we need a snack version. And then for that smaller audience, if we do still want citizen scientists, people truly are interested, we want to make that meal accessible, but we want to lead with that, because not everybody's going to necessarily engage with that. Jonathan, I know you're talking about going all the way back to your bubble chart example, right? That they're putting the bites and the snacks into the bubble chart with the annotations. right? So the data scientist might sit there and stare at that page for who knows how long, but the average reader probably isn't going to do that. So it's also thinking about, you never really truly only have one audience, and at the same time, to flip that around, everyone is also never your audience. So it's really digging in and understanding who's, yeah, I don't have a good closer for it, but those are my thoughts, and I'd love to hear from other people.
Well, we actually have a question really quickly I wanted to address. One of our guests asks, when speaking about simplifying or dumbing down the information, they wonder, is the research, when do you start to feel like maybe you're being condescending, or you're actually being that gatekeeper for the information as opposed to trying to be a good storyteller? Where's that line, and how do we avoid that? Who wants to take up that mantle?
I can start. I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I think the only way to know is to ask people. I mean, have to talk to people, and I probably, with most people on this call, I was trained as a quantitative economist. So my training was all in quantitative methods. I received no qualitative methods training in school. So that may differ for some other fields. It's not the case in economics, but like, it is not part of the, just like data visualization and writing skills and presentation skills are not sort of core parts of certainly graduate education. Talking to people and those qualitative methods are not sort of core to the graduate, to many, sort of more STEM, scientific programs. But I think talking to people and understanding, in our case, if we're just zooming in on data visualization or dashboards or website design, how people actually use the tool, how people play around with the dashboard, or scroll through the visualization, or what stories they pull away from the thing that they've read. I mean, that's really the way to do it, is to ask people, and as you ask people, and you find out, I think, what works and what doesn't work, and what's successful and what's not successful. And it's not, I think, necessarily a kind of true scientific process of having a hypothesis and finding a significant sample to be able to do this and that, but it's what we should be doing to understand how the people we want to be able to use our tools are actually using them, and to use our data. And so I think the best way to answer this question is to simply go out and start asking people, which I say simply is not a simple task. Although if you ask any journalist, which I've done, they just say, well, you just ask people, you just call them and you ask people. Like there's some magic bar where you could just go and call people up. I mean, it's not that simple, but I don't think it's that difficult. But it's I think a part of the toolkit that many of us need to develop. And I'll include myself in that. And also in terms of just like the that goes into that, right? I think many of us, we have a project, Kevin, to your point, like you have a funded project. Most funders, they want the thing out there. But the stories of impact and the finding what worked and what didn't work, they just kind of trust that it's going to work. But we all sort of get to the next thing and moving on, where I think trying to figure out how to carve out that time to ask people what worked and what didn't work, I think can be a big piece of this to the next thing that we're doing.
John, I think that also really matters for different types of communities you're talking to as well. Marginalized communities, you want to speak for them, even if it's through data. It seems like that is the first step, communication. So you can tell their story, even though it's just data and not a written story, with knowing that you're on the side of the group of people you're trying to represent. Does anyone else want to chime in? And our audience members that are on this with us, if you have a question, just post it into the chat, and I'll verbalize it so we can get to it. But we've only got about 5 or 10 minutes left, so we want to try to get those in there as quickly as possible. If you guys want to tackle that idea of especially looking at marginalized communities, being that gatekeeper or representing them correctly.
think maybe a part of that is knowing your role in that representation. That's a tough question to ask with 5 minutes left, I'd say. But that's I think that's a bigger conversation about doing your role as a data scientist and working with those communities. And I think that talking to people and understanding, like you don't want people to feel like they're subjects of a research paper. You want them to feel like you don't want them to feel like they're objects of a research paper. You want them to feel like they're subjects and are empowered. And that's where to bring it back to the topic, that's where that storytelling piece comes in. So along with the data, I think sometimes it can be developing. Of course, this completely depends on the medium. But if you can add personal stories, that's zooming into the house, right? In this case, it's not a person's house, but it's zooming into, to use the heat island example, right? We're showing a strong correlation between heat islands and communities of color. Can you go in and you tell some stories about people who live there and how that impacts them? Because that maybe you don't live in that area, but making that personal empowers those voices, and it makes it harder to ignore too.
Yeah,
I think
I'll echo that. Again, I think 3 minutes is hard to do all that. I mean, there is a field of community-based participation research methods. Again, many folks in the kind of, core data science, computer science fields aren't really aware that there's a whole branch of research on how you engage with people. And I'll just say one other thing. I mean, there are other ways for data science, data visualization folks to think about equity when it comes to their work. I mean, a simple one would be, we've already talked about language. Like language is a perfect example. Like, are you going to use the word Hispanic or Latino, Latinx, Latine? Like, what word are you going to use? And the only way you know, really, especially if you're talking about a specific region or locality, is to ask people. But what colors are you going to use in your visualization? What kind of icons are you going to use? Are you going to use an icon that, sort of your typical male and female icon when your data may have more than just binary genders? There are a lot of questions about equity, inclusivity, accessibility that I think the field is only kind of really starting to wrestle with. And a lot of that comes from who is in the field, right? Who is part of the field, right? Middle-aged, I hate saying middle-aged, but I have to. Middle-aged white male, right? Like there's a position of privilege there that is not necessarily shared, right? And I think, there's a lot of work yet to be done here. But again, the only way, and I think just to one of the other John's point, like, there is a history of extractive research in this country, right? Not just in this country and throughout the country. And so, I think there's, there is a challenge of working with communities that feel like researchers, to exactly John's point, researchers come in and they take, and they don't give back and they don't give credit, and they use research for other purposes. And there are countless examples of this. And it is, I think it is a part of the education that needs to continue, that the piece of being a data scientist or being a data communicator is not just sitting behind some computer writing code. If you want to be in the sort of world that we're in, if you want to, design something that I have no idea about, like, go ahead. But I think if you want to work in this world of data communication and data science for policy and data science for impact, there's a lot more to it than just working behind a computer and writing code.
Well, I think that's a great statement. And I think it does speak to the difficulty we all have if you're going to be taking data and telling a story. We've talked about the different audiences. We've talked about interactive. We've talked about how to tell this story and how to tell the story for people when, especially if you're not part of that group, and how difficult that is. It really seems to come down to many times, not just being a good data scientist, but being a good person. You've got to interact with people and you have to get their thoughts and reflections. And I appreciate all this talk today. This has been a great conversation. I wish we could have 10 more, but we are kind of coming on our hour, and we try to stick within that hour. I have had a great time, guys. I don't know if you have any closing thoughts, if anybody has anything they'd like to close with, you just kind of raise your hand and I'll give you a minute or so. And if there's anything in the audience wise, I don't see anything right now. Then I would just like to thank everybody. I really appreciate you coming on here. I always get to learn so much from every expert I get to have. And you guys really just knocked it out of the park. I really enjoyed talking to you, and your varied experiences have been really interesting. So thank you very much from the Midwest Big Data Innovation Hub, and we will catch you next time for our next Data Science Student Group webinar. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Bye.
having us.